Welcome to our final video in this mini-series. And our previous video talked about some of the key properties of the Fréchet distribution that could be useful in modeling certain economic phenomena. And in this video, I wanted to walk through a workhorse international trade model that features the Fréchet distribution front and center. And I wanted to give a shout out to Heitor Pellegrina at Notre Dame for sharing his notes on this paper with me to greatly accelerate my understanding of the important parts of the paper. And this paper is written by Jonathan Eaton and Sam Kortum and was published in Econometrica in 2002. And basically the goal of this paper is to bring together several features of trade models under one roof where we could have economic realism of comparative advantage that was implied by Ricardo several hundred years ago, while also being empirically realistic and able to explain the real-world data today and be simple enough that we could make valid counterfactual predictions if we changed the world in some small way. It's a grand goal, and the paper delivers on it, and it kicked off an entire new literature on trade and also racked up several thousand citations in the meantime. So this is a great place to see the Fréchet distribution in action. And the Fréchet distribution that we introduced in the video just prior is a little bit different than the one they use in this paper. And what they're going to do is they're going to model the productivity of a country as being a function of the underlying technology of that country and also the overall dispersion across all countries. And we want to think about draws from this distribution as being draws of how good a country I is at making good J. So TI you can think of as being absolute advantage, and then theta is going to govern the degree of comparative advantage in the economy globally. So if theta is super large, then there's basically going to be the case where every country is the same. And if theta is quite small, then there's going to be, the smaller theta gets, the more differentiation there will be globally and the more comparative advantage there will be. And the key idea or the key empirical formula that Eaton and Kortum want to come up with is a formula for the probability that country N will buy good J from country I, and they're calling this pi sub Ni. You can think of this theoretical object as being similar to the choice probability in a McFadden discrete choice model. And then where does the Fréchet come in? Well, the Fréchet comes in with these productivities because I'm going to buy from the lowest cost source, or equivalently the maximally productive source, and the price of a good that I'm buying might be influenced by the cost of production as well as any kind of frictions between my country and the country of origin, as well as the productivity of the country of origin for producing that particular good. So if I have a Fréchet productivity distribution, that's going to imply a particular distribution of prices that looks also Fréchet in nature. And because I want to buy the lowest price, I'm doing 1 minus the Fréchet CDF. And then because Fréchet is max stable, then 1 minus the Fréchet is going to be min stable. And so the overall minimum worldwide is going to follow a Fréchet distribution as well. And again, we're seeing something akin to the scale invariance here to get this form of the exponent. And what this is going to give us is a closed form probability for the event that country N buys good J from country I. And it looks sort of similar to the logit probability formula in the sense that I have some numerator over a sum of similar numerators. And then if we back up, one thing I failed to mention is that these Z's, these productivities, are IID across both countries and goods. So by assuming this IID Fréchet, we're not allowing for any correlation between, say, how productive China is in copper and how productive it is in aluminum. So that might turn out to be a limitation in a similar way as the independence of irrelevant alternatives turns out to be limiting in a logit model. So we've got our closed form probability. And then similar to the IIA, we're going to have this fact that these trade shares are independent of the good under question. But then because we're assuming, so in the background, I skipped over it, there's a continuum of goods. So we assume that there's just an infinite variation in goods. And because there's that continuum, that's going to give us a closed form for the expenditure share as well as the trade share. And then this is going to give rise to a gravity structure that is microfounded. So that's the key idea from this paper, is we can microfound the gravity model of trade from these Fréchet productivity shocks. And the idea that countries are buying from the lowest cost producer worldwide. So as I mentioned earlier, this shape parameter on the Fréchet distribution is going to govern the strength of the comparative advantage in the worldwide economy. And so if I have a really low value of this shape parameter, that's going to give a lot of dispersion across goods. And so countries are going to have very different productivities, and there will be more comparative advantage in the economy. And if there's more comparative advantage, that's going to mean that the trade flows are less elastic with respect to the trade costs. And then this paper also shows that the elasticity of trade with respect to trade costs is actually negative of this shape parameter. So what did assuming the Fréchet distribution actually get us in this framework? Well, it got us closed form trade shares. It got us closed form price indices. It got us a gravity equation that comes from theory. It got us a single parameter that tells us about the trade elasticity. And it gets us aggregate predictions without having to track individual goods. And since we have all of this in a tractable way, it's going to give us a very tractable way to run counterfactual policy experiments and do welfare calculations. So what are the limitations? Well, the IID assumption on the productivity shocks is pretty limiting because it's not allowing for specialization in realms of goods. So I can't have that Chile is a specialist in metals because their productivity in gold is going to be independent of their productivity in silver. There's also going to be no correlation in productivity across countries, nor is there going to be any correlation in productivity across goods. And people have relaxed these assumptions, and I don't want to go into the trade literature. I'm not an expert in these trade models. I'm just really interested in communicating how the Fréchet distribution per se can be helpful in providing these closed form formulas that make the computational side of things a lot easier while still maintaining some semblance of empirical realism. This brings us to the end of this mini-series on extreme value theory and how it can be applied in empirical economics. I hope that you've learned a few things. I certainly learned a lot in producing these videos, and I hope that you're enjoying this content, and I hope to see you around in another video. Thanks.